That day, the atmosphere at one of the most prestigious universities abroad was unusually quiet. Inside a spacious lecture hall, students from diverse backgrounds sat in neatly arranged rows, their books and laptops open in front of them. At the front of the class stood Professor Eleanor Hart, a 60-year-old lecturer with a commanding presence. Her hair was beginning to turn gray, and she wore a well-pressed black suit that exuded an air of authority. Professor Eleanor was renowned for being an exceptionally intelligent academic and an outspoken critic of religion. To her, religion was nothing more than a social construct that constrained rational thinking. She often encouraged her students to think logically and critically, challenging their beliefs. Among the students sat a 20-year-old young woman named Azia Malik. Her face was soft, but her sharp eyes radiated a quiet confidence unlike most of her classmates. She wore an elegant dark blue hijab. Azia was no ordinary student. She had memorized the entire Quran and came from a well-educated Muslim family. That morning the philosophy and science lecture began as usual. Professor Eleanor picked up a marker and wrote a bold question on the board. Does God really exist? Immediately, whispers spread across the lecture hall. Some students looked intrigued, while others seemed uncomfortable. Professor Eleanor smiled faintly as she observed their reactions. Today, we will discuss a fundamental question that has been debated for centuries, she said in a calm yet penetrating tone. Is God real, or is he merely a product of human imagination? She paused briefly before continuing. Many of you may believe in God, but do you really have a logical reason for it, or do you simply believe because of your upbringing and traditions? Some students nodded in agreement, while others appeared hesitant. Professor Eleanor took a few steps toward the middle of the classroom. I want someone brave enough to stand up and explain to me, using scientific reasoning, why they believe in God. A heavy silence filled the room. No student dared to speak. They all knew how sharp and relentless the professor's arguments could be. But in the middle row, Azia quietly raised her hand. Professor Eleanor looked slightly surprised. Then, with a faintly amused smile, she said, "Now we have someone willing to step forward. Please introduce yourself." Azia stood up, her gaze steady and unwavering. "My name is Azia Malik," she said in a soft yet firm voice. "And I believe in God not just because of faith, but because of science and logic." A deep silence settled over the hall as every eye turned toward Azia. Professor Eleanor folded her arms across her chest, studying the young woman before her. "All right, Azia," she said, "give me one scientific reason that proves God's existence." Azia's eyes sparkled with determination. She took a deep breath and smiled slightly as she prepared to answer. She realized this was no ordinary debate. This was a moment where her faith would be tested in front of an audience, immersed in rationality and skepticism. The students held their breath, some sitting motionless, while others secretly hoped Azia would present a truly compelling argument. Professor Eleanor raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Well, Azia," she said, "give me just one logical, scientific reason. I expect something rational. Or did you anticipate this question already?" Azia remained calm, then began speaking. "Professor, before I answer your question, do you believe that something complex and organized requires a designer?" she asked. The professor hesitated for a moment before replying. "Of course. The laws of physics and science show that anything complex usually has an origin that can be scientifically explained." Azia nodded. "Good. Then if we come across a watch with a complex and perfectly synchronized mechanism, we must conclude that there is a maker behind it, correct?" Professor Eleanor responded. "Yes, of course." Azia gave a brief nod before continuing, her voice growing steadier. "If that is the case, then what about the universe? It is far more complex and organized than a simple watch. Can it really be possible that something so extraordinary came into existence on its own without a creator?" Silence fell over the lecture hall once again. Some students exchanged glances, while others who had initially shown no interest in the discussion now paid close attention. Professor Eleanor chuckled. "Azia, I admit your argument is interesting, but it's far too simplistic. Science has already proven that the universe came into existence due to the Big Bang, not because of a creator." Azia smiled and said, "All right, Professor. I will follow your line of reasoning. Since we are discussing the Big Bang, I have a question. What caused the Big Bang?" Professor Eleanor sighed before answering. According to science, the Big Bang originated from a singularity, an extremely dense and tiny point that then exploded, expanded, and formed the universe as we know it today. Aziya slowly nodded, then asked, "So, Professor, do you believe that something can come from nothing?" The professor hesitated for a brief moment. She knew this was not an easy question to answer scientifically. According to the law of conservation of energy, energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only change form. So where did the initial energy that triggered the Big Bang come from? A quiet murmur spread through the lecture hall as students began whispering and discussing Aziya's question among themselves. Suddenly, a student sitting in the back raised his hand and said, "Professor, isn't Aziya's question reasonable? If everything needs a cause, shouldn't there be something that caused the universe to exist in the first place?" Professor Eleanor's expression went blank for a moment, as if she was trying to regain control of the discussion. Then she said, "This question often arises in philosophy, but science does not need the hypothesis of God to explain the universe." Aziya offered a gentle smile and said, "Professor, I understand that science seeks to explain everything without invoking God. But doesn't science have its limits? If we are unable to explain something, does that simply mean it does not exist?" The professor fell silent. She was not someone who was easily defeated in a debate, but she could tell that Aziya was not an ordinary student. She spoke with unwavering confidence. Still, Professor Eleanor was not ready to concede. Folding her arms, she said, "All right, Aziya, let's assume for the sake of argument that the universe has a designer. But how can you be sure that this designer is the God you believe in? Why couldn't it just be the laws of nature working on their own?" Aziya took a deep breath before answering. "Professor, the laws of nature are part of the system we just discussed. The law of gravity, the laws of thermodynamics, and even the DNA in our bodies all follow precise and organized patterns. The laws of nature cannot create themselves. There must be something that established these laws in the first place. In Islam, we call this being Allah, the creator who was never created." From one corner of the room, a student hesitantly raised her hand and asked, "Aziya, I want to know just one thing. If God truly exists, why is there so much suffering in this world? Why are there wars, natural disasters, and diseases?" Aziya turned to the student with a gentle smile and said, "That is a very good question. Many people have asked the same thing. But let me ask you something in return. Can we truly understand happiness without experiencing sorrow?" The student fell silent, pondering the question, while Aziya continued. "In Islam, this world is a test, and every hardship or challenge has wisdom behind it. We may not always see it immediately, but that does not mean there isn't a greater purpose behind it. Think of a small child who does not understand why their parents stop them from playing with fire, while the parents know better. Similarly, we may not always comprehend the wisdom behind what happens in our lives, but God does." A deep silence filled the room, and many students who had been skeptical at the beginning now seemed lost in thought. Professor Eleanor took a deep breath, still searching for a way to dismantle Aziya's argument, but the young woman remained calm and composed. However, the professor was not one to give up easily. She looked at Aziya sharply and said, "I must admit, you are very skilled in debate. But is your faith based solely on logic, or is there an emotional reason why you are so certain?" Aziya met the professor's gaze with eyes full of confidence. She knew this was a crucial moment. Taking a deep breath, she answered, "Professor, my faith is not based on logic alone. I have witnessed God's miracles in my life. I feel His presence in every breath I take, in every verse I read, and in every prayer I offer." Her voice deepened, filled with emotion, as she added, "I believe in God, not simply because I was taught to, but because I have found Him through my own experiences. And I believe that anyone who sincerely searches for the truth will find it too." The hall fell into absolute silence. Even Professor Eleanor did not respond immediately. Some students appeared visibly moved, while others were still processing Aziya's words. Finally, the professor gave a small smile, but this time it was different. It was no longer condescending. It was the smile of someone whose mind had been touched by something profound. However, the discussion was not over yet. The professor took a step closer to Aziya and said, "All right, Aziya, I admit that your answers have been thought-provoking. But I have one last question. but the entire class held their breath. Azia met the professor's gaze, ready for what might be the hardest question of the debate. The professor's eyes were sharp, indicating that something was still troubling her. She spoke in a serious tone. "So far, I admit that your arguments have been strong. But there is one thing you have not yet answered." She paused, letting the anticipation build, then finally asked, "If the God you believe in is truly all-powerful, why does he not reveal himself to us? Why is his existence so mysterious? If he is real, why must humans search for him?" Some students slowly nodded, as if the question had been lingering in their minds as well. It was a question that many skeptics had asked before. Asia did not respond immediately. Instead, she closed her eyes briefly, as if gathering her thoughts. Then, she opened them and looked directly at the professor, speaking calmly. "Professor, do you believe in the existence of love?" Professor Eleanor frowned slightly, surprised by the question, but she answered firmly, "Of course." Asia tilted her head slightly and said, "Then, can you show me love physically? Can you take it out of someone's heart, place it on this table, and say, 'Here it is. This is love'?" Professor Eleanor fell silent. She was beginning to see where this conversation was headed. Asia continued, "Love is real, but we cannot see it directly. We only feel it through its signs, through the way someone treats us, through their sacrifices, and through the warmth we feel when we are with those we love." Some students began nodding, realizing the depth of Asia's words. She then continued with confidence, "God is the same way. We may not see him directly, but the signs of his existence are everywhere. In the beauty of nature, in the balance of physical laws, in the ongoing miracle of life. Just as we recognize love through its signs, we recognize God through his creation." Professor Eleanor stared at Asia, her expression unreadable. She had not expected this young woman to turn her argument around so effortlessly, yet with such strength. However, she was still not ready to surrender. "Asia, I understand your analogy," she said in a calmer tone. "But still, if God truly wants us to believe in him, why does he not simply reveal himself? Wouldn't that make things much easier?" Asia smiled slightly before responding, "Professor, if a teacher gives a test to their students, do they provide them with all the answers before the test begins?" Professor Eleanor was silent again. Asia continued, "This world is a test, Professor. If God were to reveal himself directly, where would the test be? Faith is not about being forced to believe due to undeniable proof. It grows from a heart that sincerely seeks the truth." Silence filled the room once more. The students were beginning to realize that this debate was not just an exchange of logical arguments. It was something much deeper. Suddenly, a student in the middle row raised his hand. It was Michael, a physics student known for his skepticism toward religion. He hesitated before speaking. "I apologize, but I have one question. If God truly exists and is just, why is there so much injustice in this world? Why do good people suffer while the wicked live in comfort?" Asia turned to Michael and gave him a kind smile. She could sense that his question was not just a logical inquiry. It carried a personal weight. "Michael, have you ever seen an artist painting a masterpiece?" she asked. Michael frowned, unsure where she was going with this, but he replied, "Wes, of course. When the artist first starts painting, can we immediately understand what they are creating?" Michael shook his head. "No. At first, it just looks like a mess of colors." Asia nodded and said, "That is exactly what life is like. We see only a small part of the grand painting that God is creating. Right now, we may only see suffering and injustice, but we do not see the full picture. Everything in this world has a purpose, even if we do not understand it yet." Michael fell silent. He had not expected his question to be answered in such a profound way. Professor Eleanor observed the students carefully, studying their expressions as they reevaluated their perspectives. She felt that the debate was shifting from an intellectual discussion to something far more personal and emotional. However, she still had one last argument. She spoke in a low but sharp voice. "Asia, you speak so confidently about God and his justice. But what about religion itself? Religion has often been the source of conflicts, wars, divisions, and even terrorism. Many people claim to act in the name of God. So how can you defend something that has caused so much destruction?" The room grew tense. It was a difficult question. Asia took a deep breath, knowing that this was the critical moment. She spoke calmly, Professor, is a knife good or bad? Professor Eleanor frowned slightly before replying. It depends on how it is used. Azia smiled and said, exactly. A knife can be used to prepare a delicious meal, but it can also be used to harm someone. Should we blame the knife for how it is used? Professor Eleanor remained silent as Azia continued. The same applies to religion. Religion is a tool. When used correctly, it brings peace, mercy, and justice, but in the wrong hands. She paused before adding, it can be misused to justify evil. The problem is not with religion itself, but with how people choose to use it. Some students began clapping quietly, acknowledging the depth of Azia's response. The debate had reached its peak. Many in the room felt that her answers were not only logical but deeply meaningful. Professor Eleanor took a deep breath, then looked at Azia with an expression different from before. There was something in her eyes. Not just a desire to win the debate, but perhaps respect. However, she was still not ready to conclude. Eleanor exhaled slowly, then said, Azia, you've given very good answers, but I still have one last question. Azia met the professor's gaze calmly, ready to hear the question that might bring this debate to its climax. Professor Eleanor looked at her deeply and, in a softer voice, asked, if God truly exists, have you personally experienced something that proves his existence? Another silence filled the lecture hall. All eyes were on Azia, waiting for an answer that could change everything. Azia took a deep breath. She knew this was the right moment to speak. Not just with logic, but from the heart. The students, who had been taking notes earlier, were now holding their breath. Even Professor Eleanor, who had seemed so confident in her argument at the start, now appeared more attentive than ever. She looked at Azia differently. Not as someone trying to win a debate, but as someone who truly wanted to hear the answer. Azia inhaled deeply and then spoke softly. This is no longer about winning an argument. It's about something real. She paused for a moment before continuing. Professor, you asked if I have personally experienced something that proves God's existence. The answer is yes. Not just once, but many times. She looked around the entire room before continuing. I want to share something with you. An experience that I know was not just a coincidence. The students leaned forward, their curiosity growing. When I was 10 years old, Azia began, I was in an accident. My mother and I were walking home from school when a truck lost control and came straight toward us. I remember those seconds with absolute clarity. My mother trying to shield me, people screaming. And in my heart, I had only enough time for one small prayer. Oh God, please save us. Some students were visibly moved, their expressions changing as they listened. Azia continued, that truck was supposed to hit us. There was no time to run, no way to escape. But at the last moment, something happened. The truck's tires suddenly slipped, and instead of crashing into us, it veered off and hit a nearby utility pole. My mother and I were completely unharmed. Even the driver was safe. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the minds of those present. Many described it as just luck, she said. But I know it wasn't just a coincidence. It was an answer to the prayer I whispered in complete surrender. Professor Eleanor watched Azia, her eyes unreadable, as if she were processing something beyond just words. But Azia wasn't finished. And that's not all. She continued. There are many things we can't explain logically. She paused for a moment and then asked, have you ever felt such deep despair, only for help to arrive at just the right moment? Have you seen someone on the verge of losing hope, and then suddenly a solution appears that they never expected? Have you ever felt an unexplainable sense of peace while praying, even though your problem wasn't solved yet? The room fell silent. Many students began reflecting, recalling their own experiences. Azia spoke again, this time in an even softer voice. Professor, God is not always present in a form we can see with our eyes. But he is always there in a form we can feel. In the help that reaches us exactly when we need it, in the peace that no science can explain, in the small miracles we often overlook. Professor Eleanor remained silent. Her eyes seemed slightly teary, as if she was holding back an emotion she wasn't ready to show. Then, in a voice softer than before, she said, Azia, your answer is very compelling. I must admit, I've never heard anyone explain faith this way before. Azia smiled gently and replied, Professor, I am not asking you to believe immediately. Faith is not something that can be forced. But I invite you to reflect, to see life from a different perspective. Because sometimes, the truth not just what we understand with our minds, but what we feel in our hearts. A serious atmosphere filled the room. Some students lowered their heads, deeply moved by the conversation they had just witnessed. Professor Eleanor took a deep breath and looked at Asiya once more. Her expression had changed. It was no longer full of challenge, but of respect. "You are an extraordinary young woman, Asiya," she finally said. "I may still have many questions, but I must admit that your way of thinking has opened a new perspective for me." Asiya smiled and said, "Thank you, Professor." Professor Eleanor turned to her students, glancing at each one of them. Then, in a firm yet calm voice, she said, "I want all of you to take something from today's debate. Regardless of your beliefs, the most important thing is to think critically and seek the truth with an open heart." The students nodded in agreement. This had been more than just a debate. It was an intellectual journey, one that had opened many minds in the room. As the class ended, many students gathered around Isaiah, eager to continue the discussion. Even Michael, the skeptical student who had asked the sharp questions, remained seated, lost in thought, contemplating everything he had just heard. Meanwhile, Professor Eleanor left the lecture hall. Her steps were slow and deliberate. Her face held an expression that was difficult to decipher. Perhaps confusion, perhaps contemplation, or maybe something deeper. And for the first time in her life, she began to wonder, had she spent all these years closing the door to something greater than she could comprehend? And maybe, just maybe, somewhere deep within her heart, she had already begun searching for the answer. Faith is not something that can be forced. It must be found with an open heart. Miracles do not always appear in the way we expect, but they are always there for those who are ready to see them. The search for truth requires not only logic, but also inner sensitivity and personal experience. Differences in beliefs should not divide us. Rather, they should be an opportunity for discussion, learning, and mutual respect. This story is not just a debate. It is a journey in search of meaning. Sometimes, the answers we seek are not found in words, but in experience and deep reflection.